At my birthday celebration, I found myself in a surreal moment that would only make sense later. My daughter, just 12, squeezed my hand and whispered a warning. "Don't eat the cake." Her face was pale, as if she had seen something she couldn't unsee. My mother had made that cake, her smile bright and full of pride. I was supposed to be enjoying the day, but instead I felt an unease creeping in. It was one of those moments where everything seemed normal, yet there was an undercurrent of something ominous, like the subtle tension in a suspenseful movie. The cake itself was a delicate pink, not an overwhelming shade, more like a soft pastel that seemed too perfect in its appearance. It was decorated with those sugary swirls that we all remember from childhood, and have a taste that lingers, slightly artificial yet nostalgic. My name, Julia, was inscribed on it in elegant cursive. I was turning 35, a milestone that people often joke about, yet here I was, feeling like I should have life all sorted out by now. At this age, one is expected to have a handle on things like skincare routines, setting emotional boundaries, and at the very least, eating one's own birthday cake without concern. But as it turned out, that wasn't the case for me. There were 6 of us gathered around the table. My husband Ryan, our daughter Zoe, my parents, and my sister Paige. The room was filled with warmth, yet the lighting seemed overly bright, almost harsh. Someone had attempted to create a cozy atmosphere by dimming the overhead lights halfway, but it only cast a shadow of guilt across everyone's faces. My mom held up her phone, capturing the moment on video, and urged me to make a wish as I blew out the candles. If I truly had a wish at that moment, it would have been for silence. Just a brief pause from being watched, managed, or reminded of how fortunate I am. As I sat back down, maintaining a smile, Zoe reached under the table and took my hand once more. Her fingers were cold to the touch. She leaned in again, repeating her warning, "Don't eat the cake." She wasn't joking. This wasn't a dare. Her expression was one of genuine concern, her eyes wide and serious. I whispered her name, Zoe, but she just gripped my hand tighter. The next slice of cake was being served, and my mom's smile was almost blinding. She announced the flavor cheerfully. "Vanilla almond, your favorite." Ryan, sitting across from me, flashed a grin, poised to take a bite. In that moment, instinct took over, and I knocked the fork from his hand. I tried to play it off, apologizing with a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Butterfingers," I said, leaning closer to him and repeating the warning more seriously. "Don't eat it." Ryan's face twisted in confusion, still holding the fork as if it might provide answers if he pondered long enough. He glanced from the cake to me, searching for an explanation. I stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing the bathroom, and left the table without waiting for a response. Inside the bathroom, I locked the door and leaned against it, my mind racing. Zoe wasn't one to panic or exaggerate. What could have driven her to say such a thing? I couldn't just return to the table and pretend everything was fine, nor could I start questioning everyone in front of the cake. I needed answers, and I needed them discreetly. Then it dawned on me. Zoe might not have been able to speak freely at the table, but she could communicate through text. I pulled up her contact and called her, not to talk, but to devise a plan. She picked up without saying a word. I whispered for her to text me the details. Moments later, a message came through. It was Zoe. She wrote that she had overheard something in the kitchen, a conversation between Grandma and Aunt Paige before they brought out the cake. She said they were trying to poison us. I read the message in disbelief, not because it was absurd, but because deep down I was already inclined to believe her. I asked her if she was certain. Her response was immediate and firm. "Yes, don't eat it." That was it. No further details, no specifics, but it was enough for me to trust her instincts. I didn't know what was in the cake or the reason behind it, but I knew this wasn't a prank. Zoe wouldn't have said anything unless she was absolutely sure. I trusted her more than anyone else sitting at that table. Standing there for a moment, I could hear the faint buzzing of the overhead light, which matched my inner tension. I had no idea what to do next, but I knew I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. So I took a deep breath, smoothed my shirt, unlocked the door, and walked back in, trying to act like everything was perfectly fine. Ryan's cake was sitting in front of him untouched, just like Zoe's. Mine was still pristine, with a knife mark clean through the middle. Mom glanced up at me as I sat down again. She asked if everything was all right, and I replied with a simple fine, trying to sound casual. She noted that I hadn't eaten my cake, and I pointed out that neither had she. She chuckled, tapping her stomach, mentioning something about sugar and her keto diet. Paige chimed in about doing keto too. Dad just shrugged, claiming he wasn't hungry. Suddenly, the room felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. Ryan gave me a sideways glance, sensing the awkwardness, the tension in the air, and the two untouched pieces of cake. Zoe sat there, staring straight ahead, her face unreadable. I finally said I would just save mine for later. Nobody moved. Nobody touched their cake. 17 minutes later, the police were knocking at our door. It's strange, isn't it? How this wasn't the first time someone in my family had offered me something that appeared nice on the outside but left me feeling sick inside. It all began when I was 4 and Paige, my baby sister, was 2. I had this old stuffed rabbit with matted fur and a chewed ear, probably repulsive by any adult standard. One day, Paige toddled over, grabbed it, and wouldn't let go. When I tried to take it back, she wailed, and Mom told me to let her have it because I was the big sister. That was the first time, but it was far from the last. Every toy, every candy, every last cookie, if Paige wanted it, it was hers. I was always expected to share because that's what a big sister does, but it wasn't really sharing. It felt more like giving up territory over and over again. Soon it was clothes. We were only 2 years apart, close enough that our wardrobes eventually overlapped. I'd finally get a new sweater for school pictures, and Paige would start whining that she wanted it too. Suddenly it was, you can both take turns, which meant she wore it that week, and I forgot I even owned it. When we hit our teenage years, Paige had trouble with school, or maybe she just didn't care enough. Either way, I was the one our parents turned to. Could I just help her with this essay? She's tired. Paige needs to pass this math test. Couldn't I just show her how I did it? The line between helping and doing blurred quickly, and by sophomore year, I was ghostwriting at least half her English homework. But no one ever said, thank you. It was never seen as a favor, just the natural order of things. She needed something, and I provided it, like some kind of emotional vending machine. Here's what really messes with your mind. When you're trained from a toddler to say yes, by the time you're an adult, saying no feels like a crime, even when the costs are real, even when it involves money. Especially when it involves money, because Paige lost her job a year ago. Not her fault, Mom said. The company downsized. She just needed a little help, just for a bit. So I started sending her $200 a month, quietly, every first Friday. It was supposed to be temporary. She was between jobs, but somehow she stayed between them. Mom called it sisterly generosity. Dad said I was just better with finances. Funny how generosity stops feeling generous when it's expected. Then came the cruise. Oh, the cruise. It was supposed to be this grand family event, a legacy, Mom said, for generations. Matching t-shirts, sunset dinners. They'd booked it ages ago, planned group excursions, even set up a shared photo folder online with the caption, "The Big Celebration." I was already going. Me, Ryan, and Zoe. We paid our share, picked our excursions, prepared ourselves for this grand event. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, sitting here, sharing my story with the world. But I guess this is where life has brought me, and maybe, just maybe, by speaking out, I can find some peace. It all started with a simple decision, a decision that seemed so small at the moment, but ended up turning my world upside down. We were planning a family cruise, something that was supposed to be relaxing and fun, an escape from the stresses of everyday life. I booked our cabin, made sure everything was perfect for Zoe, even ordered the vegetarian option for her. It felt good to take care of those details, to know that she would be comfortable. But then came the issue with Paige and her family. She told us she couldn't afford it, that she was still recovering financially. I understood. I really did. We all have tough times. But then Mom started calling, telling me how hard a year Paige had, how much she needed this vacation. And then came the reminder that I've always been the one to look out for her. It wasn't even subtle, it was just expected. She's your sister, family helps family. But this time, I said no. For the first time in my life, I stood my ground. I said she could come if she could pay her own way, but I wasn't going to cover for her. Not again. There was this pause on the phone, a silence that felt heavy and significant. Then Mom said, "Well, I suppose that's your decision." And it was, but I felt the shift immediately, like something had cracked open beneath all the polite smiles we always wore around each other. After all those years of giving, of always being the one to help out, I finally said no, and they heard it like a betrayal. What I wasn't prepared for was what would come next. You see, that's the thing about family that no one ever tells you. Sometimes they'll forgive you for everything except for growing a spine. They'll love you right up until the moment you stop serving them. And when you finally do, they find other ways to remind you of who's in charge. That's what happened, and it started with a knock on the door. 17 minutes had passed since Zoe whispered to me, "Don't eat the cake." It was enough time for me to warn Ryan, for my stomach to twist itself into knots, and for my mother to offer more cake twice, long enough for me to sit there at the table and pretend I wasn't watching everyone like a hawk. Then came the knock. It wasn't urgent, just firm, like someone who knocks that way for a living. I opened the door, and there they were. 2 police officers, one tall and young, the other with a calm demeanor that only comes from dealing with drunk neighbors and divorce threats every night for a decade. "Good evening," the older one said, almost politely. "We received a report and need to ask a few questions, if that's all right." Behind me, the dining room went dead quiet. Even the clock sounded too loud. I asked, "A report?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "It's about something concerning this gathering." He didn't say who reported it or from where, just enough to freeze the air. I didn't have to guess long. Zoe stood up slowly, all 12 years of her, with her chin lifted like she had a badge of her own. "I called," she said. My mom made a sound like someone had thrown cold water on her. Paige actually choked on air. Zoe continued, "I heard Grandma and Aunt Paige in the kitchen. One of them asked, 'Are you sure the cake will work?' The other said, 'Yes, they won't be able to go tomorrow.'" She looked directly at the officers and said, "So I thought they were trying to poison us." She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't crying. She just said it, plain and simple. Paige stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "That is absolutely insane," she exclaimed. Mom shook her head, eyes wide with disbelief. "She's a child. She misheard. She's always been sensitive. She's 12. Paige snapped, waving a hand dismissively like Zoe was some possessed Victorian doll. "She watches crime shows. This is ridiculous." Zoe crossed her arms defiantly. "You also said don't eat the cake." That's when I knew. Dad mumbled something like, "This is getting out of hand," which, coming from the man who thought cruise insurance was a scam, felt rich. The older officer didn't flinch. He glanced at the cake on the table. "We're going to need to take that with us for testing." "You're joking," Mom said a bit too loudly. "It's standard when something like this is reported," the younger officer explained. And in that moment, everything felt surreal. There we were, a family gathered for a simple meal, and suddenly, we were in the middle of a police investigation. I couldn't process it. I just stood there, feeling numb as they took the cake away. The officers left, leaving us in a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. No one said a word. We all just sat there, lost in our own thoughts, unsure of what to do next or what this all meant. I kept replaying Zoe's words in my head, trying to piece it all together, trying to understand how we had gotten here. In that quiet, I realized something had fundamentally changed. The dynamics of our family, the trust, the unspoken rules we had all lived by for so long were shattered, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't. The days that followed felt like a blur. There were phone calls, awkward conversations, and questions I didn't have answers to. I tried to keep up appearances to act like everything was fine, but inside I was unraveling. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, the idea that my own mother and sister might have been plotting against us, against me. It gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night, haunting my thoughts throughout the day. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that Zoe had somehow gotten it wrong, but deep down, I knew better. There was a part of me that had always sensed something wasn't quite right, but I had ignored it, brushed it aside for the sake of family harmony. And now it was all coming to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. I spent hours going over every interaction, every conversation we had ever had, looking for signs, clues that I had missed. I replayed moments in my head, trying to read between the lines, to decipher the truth hidden beneath the surface. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally draining. I felt like I was losing myself in the process, losing the sense of who I was and what I stood for. The things I had always taken for granted, the people I had always trusted, were now sources of doubt and uncertainty. I didn't know who to turn to, who to confide in. Even Ryan, my rock, felt distant, caught up in his own world, dealing with his own version of the fallout. And so, I found myself here, sitting in front of this camera, hoping that by sharing my story, I can find some clarity, some peace of mind. It's not easy to open up, to lay bare the most vulnerable parts of yourself for the world to see, but I know I can't keep it all bottled up inside. I need to let it out, to process it, to heal. Maybe then I can find a way forward, a way to rebuild what was broken, to find some semblance of normalcy in the chaos that has become my life. I don't have all the answers, and I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I can't continue living in the shadows of suspicion and mistrust. I have to find a way to move on, to reclaim my life, to stand tall in the face of adversity, even when it comes from the ones I love. When I look back on that day, it feels like watching a movie of someone else's life, not mine. But it was me standing there, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me. I remember Mom's voice, the way it sounded like she was trying to win an award when she said she brought the cake. Vanilla almond sponge with pink frosting, she announced, as if it was the centerpiece of some grand event. She'd made it for Julia, she said, but I knew better. It was one of those moments when you just know something's off. I muttered something about it, but I was mostly talking to myself. The older officer stepped forward, his voice gentle yet unyielding. They needed to take the cake, he said. I watched him, waiting for what would happen next, my mind racing with what-ifs. And then, just like that, Mom's voice changed. It was like a switch had been flipped. She said it wasn't poison, those 3 words hanging in the air, freezing everyone in place. She added quickly that it was just something wild, nothing dangerous. I stood there, silent, not even blinking, my heart doing that weird thing where it slows down just so it can thud harder. Paige whispered a warning to Mom, but Mom was like a train that couldn't stop. She went on about how it was just something to upset our stomachs, saying it would have passed by lunchtime. You might have thrown up once or twice, she said, and then you'd feel better. Ryan rose from his seat slowly, as if he was trying to process what was happening. They would have stayed home, he said. Mom just shrugged, her hands fluttering as she said, that was all there was to it. It wasn't like she'd put arsenic in it, she insisted, trying to make it sound harmless, temporary. Paige looked like she wanted to disappear, muttering that this couldn't be happening. Mom turned to me, saying I needed the trip and that I always said no. She had this way of making it sound like everything was my fault because I had money and thought I could decide who deserved what. I just stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. "So your solution was to drug us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She snapped back that it wasn't drugging, it was nudging. The officers didn't seem amused. The younger one stepped forward, thanking her for her honesty and explaining the need to stay available for follow-up, which meant not leaving town. Mom mentioned the cruise we had planned for the next morning like it would change anything, but the officer was firm. "We wouldn't be going," he said. This was now part of an active investigation, and leaving could be considered obstruction. The room fell into a heavy silence. Paige looked like she'd been slapped, and Dad sat down slowly, like the weight of the situation was too much for him. Mom just blinked at the officer, as if she couldn't understand what he was saying. Zoe stood beside me, her calm presence grounding me. The older officer told her she did the right thing, his voice soft. She nodded, and that was it. They bagged the cake, treating it like evidence from a crime scene, which I guess it was. A vanilla almond confession wrapped in pink frosting. Mom clutched her purse like it was her lifeline. Paige stared at the wall, and Dad seemed smaller than I'd ever seen him before. I didn't feel any sense of satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness, like I'd been peeled open and left exposed. "They had planned for us to stay behind," I said, mostly to myself. Zoe glanced up at me, her eyes full of understanding. "They just didn't think it would be like this." The next morning, we still went. We zipped up our bags, brushed our teeth in a silence that felt stiff and unnatural, and left the house as if the world hadn't turned upside down just hours earlier. My parents weren't coming, the police had made sure of that. "Don't leave town," one officer had said, flat and final. "We'll be in touch." That was it, the whole send-off. No dramatic goodbyes, no scenes from the driveway, no guilt-tripping texts, just the most peaceful thing they'd ever given me. Radio silence. Zoe, of course, was the only one still full of energy, wheeling her little suitcase with determination and declaring at breakfast that she called dibs on the top bunk. Also, if anyone asked, she was going to tell them everything. I sipped my coffee, asking her not to, but Ryan just muttered good luck with that. The cruise wasn't anything grand. It wasn't like a royal family reunion, just one of those mid-sized, painfully orchestrated bonding trips. Just a handful of close and semi-close relatives who still used words like legacy, as if they were talking about something other than a will. Aunts, cousins, a few in-laws, all acting like this was some monumental gathering. I remember the day vividly, as if it's etched into my memory. We were on this trip, surrounded by about 20 people, give or take. It was one of those gatherings where you have to navigate awkward buffet encounters and force yourself into group photos no one genuinely wants to be in. I hadn't planned on saying anything significant during the trip. It wasn't because I felt the need to keep the peace or anything noble like that. It was simply because I was exhausted, too worn out to recount a story that still felt too surreal to fully grasp. But then there was Zoe, my daughter, who had her own agenda. We hadn't even unpacked when one of my cousins, Rachel, approached us in the hallway. I hadn't seen her in about 6 years, and she was someone I used to play Barbies with as a child. She asked where my parents were, mentioning that they were supposed to be part of the trip. Before I could respond, Zoe casually announced that they had tried to poison us. Rachel was taken aback and asked for clarification. Zoe, unfazed, explained that they had put something in the birthday cake to make us too sick to go on the trip, and that she had heard them say it. Then, as if she hadn't just dropped a bombshell, Zoe walked off to find the pool. Rachel looked at me, perhaps expecting me to laugh it off as a joke, but I didn't. That's how it all started. There was no dramatic announcement, just Zoe stating the truth as casually as if she had dropped a spoon on the floor. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would blow over. People might dismiss it as a child's imagination or some exaggerated drama. But Rachel, with her affinity for group chats, told her sister, who then told her husband, who casually mentioned it at dinner. Within a day, the story about the cake took on a life of its own. I overheard someone near the elevator mention it, saying, "Wait, that was her birthday with the cake thing?" By the second evening, I caught my Uncle Mark whispering to his wife, "Well, if it's true, she's got a point. Paige has been freeloading for years." By the third day, someone had the audacity to ask me if the cake tasted strange. I simply replied that I hadn't eaten it. Zoe, sitting next to me, added, "Because I told her not to. You're welcome." She remained unfazed, completely unbothered. And maybe that was what struck me the hardest. Her calmness. Meanwhile, beneath every joke I cracked and every nonchalant shrug I offered, something ugly and sharp twisted inside me. I kept replaying the scenario in my head. What if I hadn't listened to Zoe? What if I had taken a polite forkful of the cake just to please my mother? It wasn't even about the potential physical reaction. It was the cold calculation behind it all. The idea that someone could look at you, someone who had raised you, someone who supposedly loved you, and decide that you didn't deserve this trip, that you needed to be removed from the picture, even if just for a few days, even if it was supposedly harmless. On the third night, I lay awake as the ship swayed gently. Zoe was asleep across the room, and Ryan was scrolling through headlines on his phone. I couldn't shake the thought that they would have let me sit in that bathroom for 2 days, miss the ship, and lose the money, all while smiling about it. Not out of hatred or cruelty, but simply because they didn't care. They didn't care about what I needed or how I would feel. They just wanted Paige to go, and I was in the way. There's a word for that, but I hadn't yet said it out loud. When we returned home, the report came through. I received an email first, a vague notice that the chemical analysis had concluded, and a formal summary was attached. The report was sterile, professional, and detached, in the way only bureaucratic truth can be. They had found a mild but targeted laxative compound in the frosting. It was enough to disrupt your system for a couple of days. No long-term damage, but definitely enough to knock you off your feet. The trace was intentional, linked to a specific batch. I stared at the PDF, then at my hands. I closed the laptop and sat there, motionless. I didn't cry. Crying would have felt too neat, too simple. I just kept thinking that it was real. It had actually happened. My daughter wasn't being dramatic. She was the only one seeing clearly. I didn't call my parents after that. I remember the day it all started. It was just another typical morning, or so I thought. I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through emails, the usual mundane routine. My phone buzzed, a notification from Facebook. It was my mom's post, one of those cryptic messages asking for prayers during hard times. It barely got any attention. I felt this knot in my stomach, this urge to finally let it all out. So, without much thought, I took a deep breath and uploaded the summary. Just the page with highlighted text, no caption, no commentary. Ryan asked if I was sure. I wasn't sure about anything anymore, but I was done being silent. The comments started coming in, not angry or outraged, just surprised. People were at a loss for words, and I couldn't blame them. The next day, Paige sent me a thumbs down emoji. I stared at it for a while, feeling a mix of emotions, but I didn't reply. 2 days later, my bank app notified me that the monthly transfer to her mortgage fund was due. I deleted the automatic payment. No explanation, no heads up, just silence. They didn't reach out or mention it. But that night, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cheap chamomile tea that smelled like damp hay, I noticed how quiet everything felt. Zoe came in with a half-melted popsicle and sat across from me. She asked if I was still mad. I told her I wasn't mad, just disappointed. She snorted and said that was worse. And maybe she was right. She casually mentioned how she could have hacked into the booking system and swapped the names without all this drama, and I realized she was serious. I asked her to never develop such skills, and she just shrugged and wandered off. Ryan came in later, drying his hands on a towel, and noticed the laptop. He saw that I had posted it and didn't argue. We just sat there, me sipping my tea, staring out the window at the streetlights, and the raccoon that kept knocking over our compost bin. We weren't poisoned, not really, but something broke that day. Maybe it needed to. I didn't feel better, but I felt quieter, as if I didn't owe anyone explanations anymore, and that was something I could live with. It never went to trial. They pleaded guilty. Well, Mom did. Paige got herself a lawyer, claimed she knew nothing, classic move. The charge was reckless endangerment. No jail time, just probation, a fine, and a record that would stick harder than they probably realized. They requested to swap the fine for community service, so now Mom volunteers at a church food pantry. Barney is alive and well. They moved soon after to be closer to Paige. The group email announced it, but no one replied. Zoe still mentions it sometimes, not because it left a scar, just as a matter of fact. She even saved a screenshot of the police report in her notes app just in case. We didn't press charges, the state handled it, and that was enough. No, we weren't poisoned, not technically, but the attempt was there, and some things, once attempted, can't be undone. About 9 months later, they showed up. I wasn't expecting visitors, thought it was a package delivery, but there they were, my parents. Mom had a casserole dish, and Dad stood behind her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. They wanted to talk. I didn't invite them in, but I didn't slam the door either. We stood there awkwardly. Mom called it a mistake, a bad idea, a moment of desperation. She said they missed Zoe, that Paige regretted everything, that we were still family. I calmly told her that family doesn't drug each other to win cruise cabins. I meant it, every word. They lingered a bit longer, then Mom handed me the casserole as if that could fix anything. It was tuna. I thanked her, closed the door, and threw it straight in the trash. We haven't spoken since. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors, no speeches, just a quiet, mutual understanding. We're done. And here I am, sharing my story. Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for updates.